Well, good afternoon and welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to come and join us today for this event. And let me also thank all of you who are joining us online. Let me encourage those of you who are planning to tweet during the course of this event, so remember the hashtag CGD Talks. So today we're really very, very happy and proud in the CGD to be able to host two of our friends, Joyce Banda and also Caroline Lambert, both of whom have recently collectively produced this book, which I hope you've all now had a chance to look at, and if not, I encourage you to download a copy of it from our website, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I feel nobody really needs an introduction for Joyce Banda, but let me just say that, just to remind ourselves that she was Malawi's first female president, the second female president in Africa, but she's been a global leader and particularly a champion of women's rights for far longer than the time that she was in office as president. Having served in various official functions, and actually having spent 25 years before that as a grassroots activist, trying to help women in different vulnerable situations, trying to improve their prospects. And I should add that amongst all these other things, Joyce was also a distinguished visiting fellow here at the Center for Global Development, which we were very honored to host her for that period. And her co-author in writing this book is Caroline Lambert. And Caroline, also a former visiting fellow here at the Center for Global Development, has won several awards for her writing on South Africa's politics and business, particularly as a staff journalist for The Economist, but also more generally writing on economic and political analysis in post-conflict cases, in fragile states in particular. And this is your second co-authored book for CGD, having already done an earlier one with Todd Moss, who I think is sitting over there, and Stephanie Majerowicz earlier on cash transfers in oil-producing countries. So we are going to have a conversation soon about the book, but before we do that, we thought it would be great to have Joyce Banda read a few lines, a little excerpt from her book as a way of setting the stage, and then we're going to sit down and have a conversation around that. So let me invite Joyce Banda to come up and read some of her book.
Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first thank CGD for giving me this rare opportunity to serve as distinguished fellow here. And I came to research on women's leadership and girls' education, but what I didn't know is that I was starting a conversation, a very rare conversation that has gone global now. And I'm proud to be part of that debate now about the girl child and the gap that I see, and that is of the girl child between the ages of 0 to 10. So allow me to read just a part of what I wrote in the beginning. And thank you, Caroline, for being on this journey with me. Chris was better than I was at everything. Chris was a very good friend of mine growing up in the village, and I was growing up in town. She was better at carrying heavy loads, and she was better at school. She was at the top of her class. I was not. Yet I became a civil servant, a businesswoman. I also became an activist of women, youth, and children. I became a member of parliament, and then a government minister, and later I became vice president and then president of Malawi. And Chris never left Malawian village. She had to drop out of school, and I kept going. She stopped talking to me. She married and had a child while she was still a teenager. To this day, she can still be found in the same village while cooking over fire. For a long time, her silent question cast a very dark shadow over our friendship. Why? Why you and not me? Even as a young girl, I asked myself the same question. Why Chrissy? How many are there like her? And what can I do? I decided there and then that this would be my life's purpose. This would be my fight. So I grew up and I took this as a businesswoman, helping other women become financially independent. I took this on in parliament and then in government. I took this on in State House when I became president. I'm still taking this on through the Joyce Banda Foundation, and I will keep at it until the job is done. Chris's story is a tragedy of unfulfilled potential, a tragedy for Chris herself, but also a tragedy for Malawi and for Africa. In fact, it is a global tragedy. Over 130 million girls around the world are not in school through no fault of their own. Girls and women are one of our continent's most valuable assets. Yet, there are still many Chris's, bright, ambitious village girls full of potential, ready to become the kind of leaders that Africa needs so badly and will not get. Or because that potential is not given a chance to thrive. If we want to change Africa's narrative, we need women leaders, a lot of women leaders. Why? First, women make up half of all Africans. And it is common sense that they should be sitting at the table and participating in leadership. Having more women in leadership roles has been shown to have a positive effect on policy decisions as female leaders focus more on issues that impact on women, as well as on corruption. A recent survey in 5 countries, Kenya, Senegal, India, Colombia, and Indonesia, confirmed that over 2/3 of women policymakers thought that gender equality was getting too little attention in their country, an opinion shared by only 1/3 of their male counterparts. The moment Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as Liberia's president in 2005, she supported the creation of a Market Women's Fund. Throughout my time in office, I worked hard to narrow the gender gap as well. Thank you.
So I think that's a really powerful excerpt, Joyce, that you chose, because it brought together both the substantive focus of the book and also the personal dimension that having read this book, were the two threads that were so intertwined throughout. And I want to start by asking you, you focused on the need to create women leaders in Africa for all the reasons that you set out. And that took you to focus on girls below the age of 10. The rest, many people who have started to think about how to ensure that we set the stage for women leaders to develop, how do we ensure that there's less reduced discrimination and the harmful actions against girls, have focused on adolescent girls. And you've sort of now, the big learning for me was your focus on girls before they become adolescents. Tell us a little bit about why you think that's the right focus. What brought you to that?
I am an African woman who was privileged to have a father who worked in the Malawi police band. 15 kilometers away from my village. So our tradition had demanded that my grandmother should bring me up as a first grandchild, but my father insisted. He wanted me to go to school. So number one, how many fathers will demand to send their girl child to school? So I was fortunate in that respect. But as I said in this passage that I read, Chris, my best friend, was also same age, 5, 6, growing up in the village, going to the village school. But the family, of course, had no means to send her to school. She was obviously brighter than me. She was first position every class. I wasn't. But I have also taken the trouble to check. And I have found through my research that leaders are born. I thought that they are born with 100% leadership traits. But they are saying human beings are born, those that are going to be leaders, with 30% leadership traits. And that society has to add the 70%. And that is when this girl child has an opportunity to go to school, to be trained, to go to university, to have training. Now, that is when it bothered me. Not only because my best friend Chris ended up not going to secondary school and ended up in the village up to now, but also looking at the ultra-poor household, at grassroots. This girl child is growing in a household where she's eating last and least because the brother is eating with the father. The family doesn't mean any harm. That's the tradition. The father will eat with the boys at the mpala, what we call mpala in Malay, under the tree. Food is brought there, high quality, better quality food, while the girl child is eating with the mother the leftovers. Number two, we start working so hard. We go into our capitals on the continent. You find 5-year-olds are selling potatoes, whatever. Their brothers have gone to school. And I am a victim myself. That has an effect on our back, on our health. Chris was a champion at carrying the pail, putting on the head. I can't do that even now, especially with my weight. But then, back then, she had to put that pail on my head. I couldn't do it. But that's at 5, 6, 7, you're already carrying heavy stuff. And that weight on your back ends up giving you back problems later on. And then when resources are low, it is the girl child that is going, and the boy child going to school, the girl child doesn't go. As if that is not enough, then there's all the harmful cultural traditions that in my society, in my country, they start at 7 years old. So by 7, 8, girls have been initiated. In other countries, they've been mutilated. In other countries, there's breast ironing, so the moment the girl is approaching 10, the breasts are beginning to come, they bend them in so that she doesn't become sexual. All this is happening, all this trauma to the girl child happens before 10. In my opinion, if you start focusing on this girl child at 11, 12, 13, and unfortunately for us, most countries, all good intentions, including the American government, they earmark a lot of resources for the adolescent girl child. The Obama administration, there was a lot of resources for economic empowerment, health, education, and rights for the adolescent girl child. And then they focus on early marriage and so on. But by that time, as an African woman, it's too late. So for me, that's why I decided, let me focus on this gap. And I think I may be the only one in this room who has been a president before. And I'm also an African woman who has lived it. Let me be the one to take responsibility and raise my voice on behalf of that gap.
Now, you've been raising your voice for a long time on these issues. What made you think of writing a book? Because it's a different way of expressing yourself. How did you approach it? How did you find that experience of setting your thoughts down in a form of a book?
Yeah, you recall that when I came to CGD, first I must thank those that introduced me to Todd. I think it was Debbie and the River. I was determined that I was going to come to the US. This great country has done too much for me. I have always said that I'm a product of USAID, and I'm glad that Carol Pistre is here, who, if I was an actor, I would say she discovered me in Malawi because she was then country director of USAID. But then again, I was able to come back here. And I came to CGD. And when CGD said they could look for resources, they went to Woodrow Wilson. And so then at that point, My wish was to research on women's leadership, women's participation on leadership on the continent of Africa. And it was at the same time that a lady by the name of Leslie Udwin had just founded what we call Think Equal. She had directed the film Daughters of India. And after that, she decided, well, this girl was gang raped because maybe the girls and boys are not taught to value one another. Families are not taught to value their daughters. So maybe let me found an organization called Think Equal. And I am one of the founders of that. You can Google that. The intention was to mobilize schools across the world to change their curriculum, to ensure that girls and boys are being taught rights from age 3, from early childhood education centers. And while I'm working on participating in that organization, I'm researching on my paper at Woodrow Wilson that I said to myself, yeah, rights, but what about Africa? How much rights can you impart on a family in a typical rural setup? What about that girl child? What is it that I can do? I know that it's going to be a mammoth task. It is going to be about change of mindset. It is going to be about engaging local leadership, especially the chiefs who are custodians of tradition and culture, to change their minds on how they value the girl child. So that's the thinking in the beginning. And then it was just a paper. I was just writing a paper. But it is that paper, after I wrote it, that generated a lot of interest. That said, then I went back to Todd. I said, do you think I can put this together into a book? Small book that even anybody can put in their handbag. And so we started to go about looking for funds. And I'm very grateful to the Brain Arts Foundation, who donated the money that we required to be able for us to engage Caroline to work with me on this chain.
So that brings me to Caroline then. So Caroline, you come into this. But Joyce is actually articulating her own life experience in many ways. And for you, looking at it as an outsider, you came into it, you know Africa, but you hadn't been exposed to this set of issues in a way that Joyce had. So what struck you as the most, what was the most striking thing as you approached this writing?
So the most striking thing for me when I met Joyce was how little attention this had received, because there's been a multiplication of gender interventions, and that's, I'm very grateful to have been part of this journey. Thank you, and thank you for bringing me on to this, and realizing that we know how crucial those years are in a child's life, and in particular in a girl's life. And yet, realizing how little we know and how little gender interventions in Africa and elsewhere have focused on this particular age group was quite shocking to me. So that was the first thing. So related to that, I think because there's been very little attention on this particular section of gender intervention, is how little we know. So the lack of data, and that's something that we try to identify also in the book, is the areas where we know too little, the areas where we need to have more research, where we need to have more data and understanding, so that we can focus on the right kind of interventions and then measure their effectiveness. That was also, for me, the dearth of data was really very surprising. And the third thing that was an eye-opener as well, and it's listening to your experience around change and how change can happen, in particular in areas that have to do with mindset. This is traditionally the area where people start kind of throwing their hands up. It's like, oh my God, this is too hard. This is too woolly. This is a long-term intervention. It's going to be hard, and it's hard to measure. It's hard to do. And working with you and hearing what you have managed to accomplish when you were in office, and the kinds of intervention and what can actually happen really quickly if there is a very clear intention at the top, And then if the right interventions and if the right assistance is brought on, so mobilizing traditional structures, for example, engaging communities in a certain way, like other outfits have done. So these are things that I was not familiar with, and so for me that was incredibly heartening to see that actually, big change can happen very quickly.
Actually, before we, that's a very important point you just made, because before we came in here, we were talking a bit about how you use some of the traditional structures to change mindsets. And I think it'd be interesting if you could just say a few words on, in particular, how you work with the chiefs that play such a big role.
Yeah, I think two things. One, in most countries, they are used for politics and so on, but chiefs are very powerful in societies like mine, where whatever they say, their subjects will follow. And any wise leadership will engage them and make sure that they are on your side. And so what I did is the moment I became head of state, all of you know how I became head of state. It was when the president died. We had been elected together, and then he decided, changed his mind, didn't want to work with me because I refused to endorse his brother. So literally for 1 year, I was expelled from the party, so I didn't even attend cabinet. But stubborn me, I went and formed my own party. So here is a government where the president is another party, the vice president is another party when he drops dead. So they struggled to allow me to take oath. So suddenly I take oath and then I become president. And by that time, the country was in a very bad state. And in fact, the British had closed, they had withdrawn their ambassador and deported ours from the US, the UK. We had no fuel for a day. There was no food for 2 million people. And so I decided that I was going to engage the traditional leadership. I was going to turn those into champions, to work with me on issues that we wanted to change, particularly at grassroots level. And for the first time, they realized how important they are. They realized that they could be well utilized, their efforts could be properly directed, working with government. So what happened is I wanted to focus at that moment on maternal health, and then just engaging them and telling them that if any woman dies in your village giving birth, it's your fault, you should take responsibility. And each one of them, they formed a network, they elected leadership. They had, for the first time in Malawi, to see a male chief talk about maternal health, talk about women going into labor, talk about controlling the number of children you can have, talking about having one wife is okay, eating with your family is fine. And in that village, when I took my friends from the US, when they came, they found that they had written even messages on the wall. A real man buys a bicycle to take his wife to the hospital. A real man goes with his wife to maternity clinic. And with the help of the Bill Clinton Foundation, we were able to begin a male engagement program where men were involved in their wives' maternal health. So suddenly what happened is our clinics became congested, because every woman now pregnant was ending up at the clinic. And then that's when we engaged the private sector to help build holding shelters at our clinics so the women could go there a week or two before and wait there until labor starts so that they are close to trained personnel. So I learned that you can use them for education, you can use them for nutrition. So when a chief says every girl child in this village shall go to school, every child shall go to school. So it is just a lost opportunity that all these years we didn't know that they could be that effective, but we were able to use them that way.
I think there's quite a lesson in there for many countries where there are traditional structures
Yeah,
that coexist alongside formal ones.
Yeah.
And if they're not brought on board, then many of the changes you want to bring about start faltering at the ground roots level.
And secondly, in the area that I come from, girls at 8 and 9 must go for initiation. And when the church came, they tried to persuade the chief to abolish initiation. He just couldn't hear it. He refused, but that's how I also knew how powerful they are. But you can also work around them. And then in the end, that particular chief, who is by the name of Chief Malemia, they agreed that they were going to hand over that function to their church. So that was a better way of dealing with it. So now girls still go. Psychologically, the parents feel that the child has been initiated. The chief gets his money because it's a monetary issue. Because every time a girl goes for initiation, the chief gets money from the family. So that is what sometimes they don't want to lose. So the chief gets his money. The family feels the child has gone for initiation, but they're ending up in the church singing choirs and the prayers. So at the end of the day, it's a win-win situation. So they can be engaged in so many different ways.
I want to open it up because I know people in the audience will all have questions for you. And if I could just ask you to identify yourself and then ask your question and try to keep it relatively focused. So I think we'll start with the lady over here, and somebody's going to bring a microphone to you.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a health economist studying at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'm very interested in all the comments you're saying, and especially when it comes to traditional structure. It's interesting how you said formal versus traditional. And so how do you think we can engage more with international development to take into consideration the fact that cultures in Africa are there is a formality in the traditional settings. And so there is a lot of push to kind of formalize all the traditional and make them more similar to international structures and the way they work. And so how can we engage with international development and make sure that assistance come, but they're also very respectful of the culture that we have without having to make it more formal, I would say. I don't know.
Thank you. Should we take a couple more questions just then come back to you? If you'd like that, or anybody else want to raise a question? This is a gentleman sitting in the back there. Yep.
I'm Bill
Just,
McGreevy.
Bill, there's
Bill McGreevy from Georgetown University. A couple of people who teach at University of Chicago have given a huge amount of emphasis to preschool education. Before the first graders of age 5 or 6 years old, that preschool education is hugely beneficial and shows up even decades later. Your studies sound like they are exactly aligned with that kind of view. I'd like to hear more of what you might say about that.
Okay, maybe we'll take those two and then we'll ask for more. So the first really was a set of issues around how we can deal with the fact, how do you ensure that international engagement works with but recognizes and respects in a way the sort of traditional structures rather than trying to align them in ways that might become artificial. So, and then the second one is about preschool education.
I think first and foremost, I'll say what I've said before, is that what is important is for us to forge smart partnerships, that the international NGOs realize that we should own the programs on the ground, and that so we can work together. But for goodness sake, we must not be ignored, because what I have found is that we just waste a lot of resources. This little organization will be doing their own thing. This huge organization will come with abundant resources, but then wrongly directed, and then at the end of the day, it's a waste. That's number one. Number two is when those of us in Africa, the NGOs in Africa, own the programs, we should demand respect when they come. When partners come, they will know that we deserve to be respected and to be recognized. And I have found that it's not only when you are educated. I have found that even grassroots people who, with community programs, they know exactly what they want to achieve. They know how to get from point A to point B. And I mean, to be poor is not to be dumb. So therefore, they need respect. And it's those kind of partnerships that are created based on respect that at the end of the day yield more.
And then I think Bill McGreevy had this question about the work on
Yes, I
preschool
have.
education.
We have found in Malawi that in Malawi it is only 30% of the children that have access. The time that I checked, I don't know about now. By the way, I've only been home 2 months, so I'm still excited about what's going on. But before I left, only 30% of our children had access to early childhood education. The Joyce Banda Foundation runs early childhood orphan care centers, and early childhood education is provided there. And we found that we take these children who have no parents through early childhood education to 5 years old. Then they go to primary school, which is free. But we found that at every stage they do better than children who didn't have access to early childhood education. Unfortunately, government is not able to provide all that due to resources. I wish there was a way of looking after our resources better. They say that we require 40% of our resources to come from donors, and yet there's wastage of 30% on the ground. So if we only could be prudent enough to look after those resources, we'll be able to send more children for preschool education.
But, so can I just follow on a bit from what Bill was saying? I mean, when I read your book, though, my sense was that preschool education was one part of a sort of bigger package of changing mindset for the girls under 10, and that it was also about many different ways in which they had to be supported to be able to realize their full potential. So the work that's being done on preschool education now that you refer to, how much of that helps to get into some of these other issues?
I feel that in Joyce Banda Foundation now we feed about, is it 15,000? Yeah, 15,000 children each day. But those 15,000 children are fed with the support, what I said earlier, Smart Partnerships, an organization in Utah called New Scheme are the ones that donate the food to Malawi, and they identify credible NGOs that in turn feed the children. And so we provide this food to the children. But with now the new curriculum that I was talking about from Think Equal, is that if you start to teach the girl child and the boy child at 3 years old about rights, then the girl child begins to grow, realizing that I don't have to be treated this way because I'm a girl child. And the boy child also knows that I may be a boy, but I can also, it's okay for me to cry, because those are little things that I can talk about all day. Because, and the perpetrators in Africa, I say they are women, because I will tell my son, don't cry like a girl. And then I'll tell the girl child, don't behave like a boy. And so they will start to separate them early in life. But when they go to early childhood education, where they are taught you are equal, you can go into your mother's kitchen and you can also play with a little bicycle. It's okay, it's fine. And you can eat with your sister, and your sister can eat with you. They begin to consume the same type and same level of food. So, but then it is the resources that are standing in the way. Because this, what I'm talking about, is what we can do at NGO level. But governments are failing to do this. So if only now, 54 years after independence, only 30% of our children have access to early childhood education, then we have a long, long way to go.
I think what you just said probably applies to many, many countries, not just in Africa, but in many parts of the world, where I think that same conversation could usefully be had at that early stage of life. Let's see if there are any. So there's a lady in the back there. There's a lady over here, and I'll come to the other side in a minute.
Hello, my name is McKenna and I go to UT Austin in Texas. I'm here interning this summer. And I had a question, we've talked about like smart partnerships at the NGO level, but what does that look like on a government level, especially because, you want the implementation to happen on the ground? What is like an appropriate way for governments to like help out without being like overbearing?
Okay. And then there's a lady over here. Tanvi's going to just follow.
Hi, I'm Sirtaj from the Global Partnership for Education. My question is, I wanted to marry something that Caroline had said and the topic of this conversation. And you said that change can happen very quickly when there is will at the top, and also that sort of supporting girls is essential for Africa's future. So I want to know what your thoughts are on like a larger African agenda around girls' education. How do you see leaders coming together to talk about this? Do you feel like there's space for improvement there, and how you see the way forward? I guess directed at both of you.
Thank you very much. Okay.
We have found while doing this research that it is extremely difficult to even collect data on girls between 0 to 10. In some countries, they actually don't want, they close you out. Because it's a shame when issues begin to come out of what the girl child is going through. So they are very sensitive about what you can check, and now the excuse will be, no, they're too young to be interviewed. So it's not easy. And you asked whether, do I see the leadership across Africa getting together? I don't see it. I don't see it because we have found another way. African women leaders have formed what we call the African Women Leaders Network under the auspices of the UN Women and African Union Gender Department. And the reason is because we want to tackle issues of girls' education directly ourselves, because we know that it is not easy. It wasn't even easy to incorporate into the SDGs sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we have to be sensitive about things that we can argue about and we can take forward. And but I think to come back to your question, no, it's not easy for African leaders, all of them, to sit down and discuss. I addressed young people in Senegal. It was an intergenerational conference. And I pushed them, but we have to push them from the back to say that you must raise your voices. You must go to the African Union and demand accountability as young people. Because a 67-year-old woman like me, if I come to the front, then I'm just declaring war on myself.
And the question from the lady over there was about, what do smart partnerships look like when you take them to the government level?
Yeah, in most countries like Malawi, there is a network of NGOs. For example, in Malawi, there's Council for Non-Governmental Organizations. Mm-hmm. And I was the first chair of the National Gender Coordinating Network, which brought together 69 gender NGOs. When you're coming from outside, that is the organization that you interface with as you get yourselves legally established. You must go to Kongoma, Council for the Non-Governmental Organizations, to get registered. There is no country in Africa, if they are there, there are very few, that will look upon NGOs as friends. I come from the civil society. I accidentally ended up in government myself. And so I know that at every stage of the way, we had to fight because NGOs are looked upon suspiciously. And then that's why we are grateful to those organizations like USID, where we could run to. We have a bright idea. We know we can bring about change, but we know we can organize ourselves. And half the time, if they found that you have organized your fellow friends, like when I founded the National Association of Business Women, USID was clearly on my side. By the way, Carol, can I introduce you? Can you stand? Yeah, so Carol was the country director for USID. So there are times when I had to run and hide in her office where they were looking for me. So there is no time when you are going to have a grand relationship with the government. And so whether you are coming from outside or not. So what strengthens you is as an international NGO, you get into an African country, you go to Council for Non-Governmental Organizations, you find a partner, you check them out to ensure that you are getting a credible organization, you partner and then you become strong, and government will reckon with you at the end, not the other way around.
Caroline.
Yeah, to build up on that and to answer hopefully part of your question as well, I would stress the importance of data and ranking in order to put pressure. We've seen in other areas the magic that some international rankings or does to focus the mind, to pressure governments to take action, because no country wants to look bad. And so when you start measuring and ranking, I mean, we've seen that in the doing business rankings, for example, it creates healthy competition. And then, from one year to the next. So when you start doing that, and if the same could be done on gender issue, on girls in particular, if we start measuring and ranking countries, I think that would go a long way in at least putting the issue on the table and convincing or nudging governments and international organizations, regional organizations to start really looking at this issue and to start improving things. And on the SMART partnership, I think part of the answer on that, and that's also what we've tried to do in the book, is to recognize that NGO on their own can't do it, governments on their own can't do it, international donors on their own can't do it, and it's to recognize the limitation and the role of each of these actors and how powerful they can become if they work together, but that each one has a very specific role to play.
Thank you.
So, sorry, just to finish on
please.
that. So, governments, for example, I mean, yes, of course they have to be on board. They have to, especially on data, laws, constitution, et cetera, et cetera. There are a number of, but in a lot of places, but in particular in rural Africa, the reach of the state has very concrete limitations. And that's why in those contexts, enrolling NGOs, enrolling traditional chiefs that at the village level have much more of an impact becomes essential, because governments can pass any law they want. We've seen that a lot regarding child marriage, for example. It's outlawed in a lot of places. But unless there is a reach and work that is being done at the community level, a law in itself is essential, but it's not sufficient.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Actually, one of the interesting things in your book that you've written is a section that talks about what different communities can do, what can governments do, what can international actors do. And I think a kind of nice point on which to bring this to a close is to say, well, what can each of us do as individuals? What is it that we could do to be able to help advance this agenda? And I wonder if you wanted to share, Joyce, your thoughts on that. And I remember that I think you have a very nice section at the end of your book where you actually talk about that.
Yeah, then maybe let me read it so that I'm accurate. Allow me to just read it. Change is not the prerogative of governments and organizations, whether from Africa or elsewhere. We all have the power to make a difference for young girls. In practice, become a role model for girls. Role models inspire young girls to dream bigger and aim higher. I never forgot Rose Chivambo. I hope that being Malawi's first woman president has inspired young girls in Malawi to believe that they too can one day become leaders in whatever field they choose. It is never too early to become a role model. It is never too late. Any girl can become a role model for her siblings, her friends, and her community. And this Rose Chivambo that I mentioned was Malawi's first cabinet minister. And I remember that we used to go on Zomba Mountain to pick firewood and wild fruits. And then we would come down the mountain, and the parliament was just down the hills, and then we would drop our firewood bunches and sit there and just watch people get into parliament. And what never left my mind throughout growing up was to see a woman for the first time in my country in a white hat, in a beautiful black and white suit, walking there. And I remember asking, and I was just 12, 13, asking a passerby to say, who is that? And she said, that's Rose Chivambo, Malawi's first cabinet minister. And I said, cabinet minister? How do people become cabinet minister? What is that? Member of parliament? And we picked our bunches and went back home, but I never forgot. And I'm glad I lived long enough to become president, and she was also still alive. Yeah. So give back. My only request to any girl or woman I have ever helped was persevere and help others. That way, helping just one girl ripples to several others. In the way that helping Dorothy after she lost both her parents later changed the lives of young girls, starting with her younger sisters. This is a girl that came to school at Joyce Banda Foundation. At the end of the term, I asked that we have a prize-giving ceremony for the best girl of the previous term. And then they told me, no, she had left. They were being asked to contribute 3,000 kwacha that time, I think $3. But she didn't have, and I didn't know. And she had left, and this is now the next term. And they said, well, she left, she couldn't pay the $3. And I said, well, you didn't tell me, go and find her. They went 8 hours away, they got her back. She was the best student every class. She passed with distinction. She was selected to go to Bunda College of Agriculture, became an agricultural economist, ended up at Makerere University to do her master's. And she came back, and she has educated her sisters all through education, all the way to university. Many others, women and girls who have been lucky enough to receive an education are in a position to help others follow in their footsteps by providing financial assistance, mentorship, or inspiration. You don't have to be in Africa to change the lives of young African girls. A number of organizations have leveraged technology so that anyone is able to directly sponsor a girl in need and establish a relationship. Mobilize or join existing movements. I've met extraordinary young girls in the United States who started initiatives to support their sisters in Africa. African girls and women such as Kakenya, Taia, who underwent female genital mutilation and demanded to go to school, are speaking on the international stage to raise awareness about the plight of young girls and mobilizing for change. Kakenya has joined Words and Action. She's also helping other girls in the education sector that they deserve, to get the education they deserve. I met a girl child who at 7 years old lives in South Carolina. Her name is Mongai. I was hoping she would be here today. She went home with her mother to Cameroon at 7 years old and saw fellow children going to school carrying their books in plastic bags, plastic papers. And then she asked her mother why they don't have backpack. That's what you call it here in America. And they said, no, they can't afford. She came back, she told her teacher. They helped her raise 50 bags. She was 8 when she went back to distribute those 50 bags to her friends. This last year, she distributed 10,000 bags. She has now got a fully fledged organization, registered. She received an award in South Carolina. She's now 15, and she's now working with the Oprah Academy in South Africa. And she has just been a guest of honor to the president of Cape Verde, and she's 15. So you can start at any age, and you can touch other lives and make a difference.
Well, I think, Joyce Banda, that's a very powerful story on which to end this session. And before we end this session, I know that there are 2 guests in our audience, Sarah and Coleman, who are been very patiently sitting in the front row, and who I know want to give you a little card. Come on up.
Wow. Thank you. photo. Come. Thank you. Thank you. This is my best friend. She's going to be a bee. What are you going to be? She's going to be a bee scientist. So one time she had an event where Mrs. Pence, the wife of the vice president, was guest of honor. And she said, then I want Joyce Banda to come as my guest. So I was her guest. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Sarah and
Thank
Coleman.
you. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
And let me thank Caroline and
Thank you.
Joyce for being here. And thank you all. So please join me in a big round of applause for our two guests. Thank you. That was great.